Creation stories are rather rare. They're not very prevalent in pagan mythology. And if they do exist, they are oftentimes of a violent, chaotic, or carnal nature. Also, if they do exist, they're not typically of a central or foundational religious importance to that community, almost as if it is a preface to whatever it is that they then really want to tell you later on. And last of all, if creation myths or stories are part of pagan mythology, it's really there to explain why is the world so messed up. We see all the evil that is around us. It must then come from an evil source. The Christian story of creation is different. We see in our reading today from the book of Genesis, that first chapter in the first verse, that our story of creation is an act of the will. It's an act of freedom. It's an act of reason. It is an act of love. And we see in there that when God looks upon the creation that he has made, he calls it good. It is the proclamation of the innate goodness with which creation is made and with which creation still exists. Though it may be disfigured over time by sin, in its essence, it is still something good. And from this source, from this thesis, the whole story then unfolds. From this seed that is planted at the very beginning, the flower, the tree then buds forth and bears fruit. This story determines everything. Now, the story doesn't answer the question of how. How does creation come about? That is a question that we give over to science and allow them to do what they do best in determining that. But what this story is meant to answer, it's meant to answer the question of why. And that is a question for philosophy, theology. That is our question to be answered. Pope Benedict writes this as a suggested answer to that question of why. Why creation? He writes, "Creation is a setting in which the entire history of love between God and his people develops. Hence, human salvation is the reason underlying everything. From the smallest atom of hydrogen to the most distant star, the purpose of all that is there, everything in between those two things, is for the purpose of human salvation, to bring us into that intimate and everlasting union with him." Now that's a bold claim. That's a big universe. And you're telling me that its whole purpose is just for that? Yeah. And if you're going to disagree, you may do that. But you have to provide an alternative solution, an alternative reason for all that is. Why is there something rather than nothing? And if there is something, what is its purpose? What is its meaning? What is its end? Pope Benedict goes on to say somewhere else, as Cardinal Ratzinger, before he was elected as Pope, he says the reason that story exists and then the way in which it unfolds is for this, that the Old Testament represents an advance or a progress, a stepping toward Christ. Only when it attains to him, only when it reaches him, does its real meaning become clear. Every individual part derives its meaning from the whole. Every individual chapter is understood only within the context of the whole story. And then the whole derives its meaning from the end. And that end is Christ. What is true for the human story, what is true for the Jewish story, is also true for our story. Where we begin and where we end. Beginning in a similar story of creation when each of us was formed in our mother's womb. Coming to an end of the story when we reach that ultimate union with Christ. So each part of that story, each chapter of that story only derives its meaning from the whole. And the whole of our story, the whole of our life, only derives its meaning insofar as it brings us closer to union with him, the one for whom we have been made. Today we celebrate the memorial of St. Paul Miki and his companions, martyrs in Japan. And they were brought there as Jesuits to be missionaries among the people there. But when their influence began to grow, the emperor was jealous and he decided to kill the Jesuits and try to eradicate Christianity. They marched them 600 miles to Nagasaki. The whole time they were singing hymns of praise to God. When they arrived in Nagasaki, they crucified them and pierced them with lances. That time they were praising God, exhorting the people, and forgiving their enemies. Sound familiar? It is a remake of a much more ancient story, right? The story of our salvation. What allowed them to do that? What allowed them to persevere through such a difficult chapter in their life? They saw it as a part of a much greater whole. A whole that they saw and they knew its beginning, a whole that they knew its end. It was a whole that was a story of love.